Welcome to a special edition of System Update. I'm Glenn Greenwald. Tomorrow, our regularly scheduled show will appear in the Intercept's YouTube program at 2 o'clock p.m. Eastern. It's on Wednesday, and that's devoted to exploring the mental health ramifications of the coronavirus pandemic, as well as the measures of isolation and quarantine that we're undertaking in response to it. But for today, I have a special edition of the show that is a response to recent news events, including the announcement by Bernie Sanders that he's endorsing Joe Biden, devoted to exploring the relationship between supporters of the Bernie Sanders campaign and the left generally on the one hand, and the Joe Biden presidential campaign on the other. And to help me explore those questions, I'm joined by two very special guests, one of whom is Briahna Joy Gray, longtime press secretary of the Bernie Sanders campaign, who will be with me in just a few minutes. For now, I have, welcoming to the show, the host of the very popular podcast, The Benjamin Dixon Show, who was responsible for some of the most consequential and devastating scoops about Michael Bloomberg and his candidacy, Benjamin Dixon. Ben, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
Glenn, it's a pleasure. Good to be here.
Yeah, I'm glad you could make it. So there's obviously a campaign underway in the wake of not just Bernie Sanders' announcement that he's suspending his campaign, but particularly that he's endorsing Joe Biden, which was made on Monday as part of a live stream with Biden, where Bernie Sanders announced that he would do everything possible to help elect Biden the next president and defeat Donald Trump. And there's been a campaign to persuade, or I'd say more cajole and coerce, supporters of Senator Sanders' campaign to follow him in doing that. What is your perspective on that call to follow in Senator Sanders' footsteps and endorse Joe Biden?
I mean, I think the first thing is it puts the cult of personality argument of Bernie supporters to rest, because there's so many Bernie supporters who have made it clear that they are not going to follow Bernie Sanders in their endorsement of Joe Biden. And it also just speaks to the fact that he's a man of his word. I mean, he's been saying this. Even though it was a little disappointing for a lot of people, I don't think it should have been a surprise for anyone, because he's been saying this since day one, that whoever would be the nominee, that he would support them. So he's keeping his word. And it really just shows that the people who supported him, they weren't there just because of Bernie Sanders, the personality. They were there because of the policies that he was supporting. And so there's a huge disconnect between what Joe Biden is offering versus what the people who supported Bernie Sanders are looking for.
Yeah, I mean, Bernie Sanders in 2016, once he finally dropped out of the race and acknowledged that he wouldn't be the nominee, through his support behind Hillary Clinton, he toured the country holding rallies for her, and famously stood up on the convention floor when a lot of his delegates were quite angry and boisterous about that anger, and was the one who put her over the edge by pledging all of his delegates to her. So it shouldn't come as a surprise to anybody. Surprise or not, though, there are a lot of people who aren't willing to follow in Senator Sanders' footsteps. As you said, there are a lot of people who are exercising their independent judgment, which is contrary to the cult personality of a narrative that has been propagated for years now about the Sanders campaign. What is your personal view on that question about whether you intend to devote your resources and your energies to supporting Joe Biden?
Yeah. You know, what I'm dedicating my show to is really empowering people to make that decision for themselves, because I think that's the most important thing. What I don't think is appropriate at this point is for people to use their platforms as a bludgeoning tool, because if you're honestly trying to convince people and persuade people to move from, no, I won't support Joe Biden, or I'm undecided, you can't do it by bashing them across the head, rhetorically speaking, obviously. Anyone who's been in this commentary or this punditry game for a while, you understand that you have to give the people some space and let them vent. Let them feel what they are feeling. And that's really what I'm using my platform for, is because I have a lot of supporters of my show who are going to vote for Joe Biden. Then I have a lot more who are not going to vote for Joe Biden. And so let them sort it out for themselves. They are independent thinkers. They have free agency. They can make the decision for themselves, and they make a good argument. I mean, if you listen to either group, either camp, they make a very valid argument why you should vote for Joe Biden and why you shouldn't. For me personally, I'm more focused on whether or not We're going to have mail-in ballots because I think the sleeper issue at this time is the coronavirus and whether or not people are going to have to physically go to the polls. And for me personally, like I'm not going to physically go to any polls so long as we don't have a vaccine. So I think that's a very significant it's a backstory that's happening right now that we're not really paying that much attention to in terms of in terms of the bickering that's going on back and forth. I think it might all be academic if we don't secure mail-in ballots.
Yeah, it's really interesting. That's always been my posture as well when people have asked me, for whom do you intend to vote? Who do you think other people should vote for? I think it's incredibly presumptuous and even bizarre to think that I should or can dictate to other people who they ought to vote for. I much more view my role similar to what you're describing as providing information, as providing the space to have rational, free discussions where people aren't stigmatized one way or the other and allow other people to make up their minds rather than trying to force them or push them. But I do want to ask you about some of the arguments that are being invoked on both sides. And I'm particularly interested in the group of people that you know well, who are your listeners, who are currently of the mindset that they're either not willing to commit to Joe Biden or saying that they never will. One of the things that strikes me is that in politics generally, the way that you move people is you convince them that if they take a certain action, if they support a certain candidate, their lives are going to get better, or the lives of the people that they care about most are going to improve. That's something that Donald Trump, as a con man, did really well in 2016. He made promises that he never could keep, never intended to keep, like going to West Virginia and saying, I'm going to bring back your coal jobs. And I heard people in West Virginia say, look, we knew it was bullshit. We knew he wasn't going to bring our coal jobs back, but at least he was talking about it, which signaled that he realized we were suffering and that we wanted to hear a solution. So one of the things that I'm looking for and listening to among the people trying to push people to support Biden who are either reluctant or refusing are arguments about why they ought to, based on concrete benefits that will accrue to their lives or the lives of people they care about if they do. And what I'm hearing instead is something much different, this kind of manipulative argument that if you don't do it, it means you're privileged, you don't care sufficiently for marginalized people, even though a lot of people refusing are themselves in marginalized groups. Yeah. What do you think needs to be demonstrated, needs to be done and said to reach as many people as possible who are in that group that you described, people who you know but who are reluctant to or even refusing to support Joe Biden?
Yeah, so there's a couple of things there, right? I read your article about the argument about the privilege, and I think that can't be overstated. There are so many people who are marginalized, who are making the conscious decision to not support Joe Biden because they don't see that there is any type of material benefit for them in doing so. He really was not. I mean, he's starting to change his tone a little bit now that the primaries are over, saying that, well, we can't afford to go back to normal. But everything up to this point, his entire platform was let's go back to normal. Well, normal for a lot of people is really bad. Right. Normal for a lot of people who are living in marginalized communities says that the government and politicians don't care about us whatsoever. And so I think it's incredibly disingenuous for someone to say that that if you don't vote, that you're privileged, when we could see, like, particularly in the Black community, there are thousands upon thousands, hundreds of thousands, into the millions of Black people who will not participate in this system because they feel neither party is going to provide any material benefit. Even now, I'm a part of a group of a lot of Black leftists who are all making the argument that voting for Joe Biden is insufficient because he is not going to provide any material benefit for them, for us, because that's what he was saying throughout his whole platform. We're going to go back to normal. Well, normal really wasn't good for a lot of Black people in this country.
Yeah, it's really interesting. I think one of the things that happened after the 2016 election was there was a search for villains to blame Russia, to blame WikiLeaks, to blame Jim Comey, to blame the New York Times, and very little self-reflection. And one of the key and crucial facts that would have been discovered had there been self-reflection on the part of the party or the Clinton campaign was that a big reason why they lost those swing state votes isn't necessarily because their key constituents went and voted for Donald Trump, because they just stayed at home. And there were articles interviewing people kind of anecdotally, but also data about why that was. And they said exactly what you just said, which was, we don't think that it was worth it, like spending an hour or 2 hours or 5 hours in a polling line to vote for a candidate that we don't think is actually going to improve our lives, regardless of who wins, is going to affect our lives in any significant way. Do you have hopes that the Democratic Party does recognize that and will make the kinds of concessions, not just rhetorically, but substantively, that need to be made to demonstrate that they learned that lesson?
No, I don't. I guess if you view this through the lens of harm reduction, then you're going to say, okay, the Democrats are bad, but they're not as bad as Donald Trump. So that's an argument that I'm hearing everywhere. But in terms of your just straight on the merits of your question, no, I don't even think that the Democrats actually want to win. If I keep it 100 with you, I think that they are just going through some type of performance to protect their power. And by power, I mean jobs, their resources, the consulting class. All of that was threatened by Bernie Sanders. And now that Bernie Sanders is out of the race, their jobs are secure. The consulting class is going to make their money regardless of who wins. I mean, the Democratic consultants, they are going to make into the tens of millions, into the hundreds of millions out of this race. So even if Donald Trump wins, they still get what they needed. What threatened them really was a candidacy. The candidacy, if Bernie Sanders got the nomination, that would have been a material threat to them. And so I don't really think, excuse me, I don't really think that they have any intention in winning, just performing. That's just my take. I know a lot of people may disagree with that, but everything up to this point, if they were serious about beating Donald Trump, then they really picked the very worst candidate they possibly could to do that.
Yeah, I think you saw a lot of that in 2016 on the Republican side, where so many lifelong Republican consultants who had no problem working for Ronald Reagan, no problem working for Karl Rove on behalf of George Bush and Dick Cheney, suddenly declared that they found Donald Trump so offensive, so intolerable, even though he was a conventional Republican in every significant way, essentially. Right. And the reason was because he was an outsider who wasn't going to usher them into power. Their livelihoods were threatened as GOP consultants, as GOP operatives. That was the reason they were and continue to be so vehemently opposed to Trump. They would have been fine with Marco Rubio or Jeb Bush or even Ted Cruz, anyone who would have preserved their power, right? That's they were desperately trying to get behind anyone. So let me ask you as the last question, not about the Biden campaign, but about the movement that grew up around Bernie Sanders, because I think a lot of people who are independently and critically minded understood that Bernie Sanders was always kind of an imperfect vessel for this political revolution. He's been in Washington for decades. He's been in the Senate. He's been working alongside those Democrats. It's hard to really have the right kind of animosity that you need for people that are essentially your work colleagues. Like, he clearly likes Joe Biden personally, and that makes it a little bit difficult to channel a lot of the rage against the establishment that Trump had succeeded in channeling against the GOP establishment. But where does this movement, this kind of left-wing populist working class movement, go from here now that the Sanders campaign is done? Is the solution to continue to stay attached to the Democratic Party, or is it to say the Democratic Party is not ours? Maybe one day it will be ours, but for now it's not. We need to start looking for other avenues to accrue power, and if so, what are those other avenues?
Yeah, I think the number one thing we have to do is to remain consistent and to not to fall back completely. I think everyone is going to need a little break. I think people who poured the most into this campaign, people who flew all around this country to volunteer, people who phone banked and text for Bernie Sanders, I think they're disillusioned, and rightfully so. I mean, they put all of their heart into this campaign, and we suffered a really crushing blow. So they're going to need to take some time off, but I don't want them to stay away too long, because I see it personally as a 2-year and a 4-year head start on the next campaigns, and that we don't focus solely on electoral politics, that we get on the ground organizing so that we can show the communities that we purport to serve that we are there, not just when it's election year, but we're there year round, 24/7. And I think if we put our energy into organizing on a local level, on a state level, and as well as on a national level, and we begin to do so now, continue to do so, not begin, but continue to do so, then we can build the power, we can build the credibility, and we can build the organizations that we need to really bring truth to power.
Well, Ben, let me congratulate you on really not just elevating your platform, but having a huge impact on the presidential primary. I think there was no person who did more to torpedo the Michael Bloomberg candidacy than you did. Maybe Elizabeth Warren in that debate can compete with you. But I think you really laid the foundation for the attacks that ended up torpedoing what was really a menacing candidacy in so many ways. And congratulations on the platform that you're building as well. I think you've been an incredibly important voice in a lot of these issues, and I'm sure you'll continue to be. So thanks for taking the time to talk to me.
Thanks, Glenn. It means a lot. I appreciate it.
All right. Thanks, Ben. I'm joined now by another special guest who was, until extremely recently, the press secretary for the Bernie Sanders campaign. Prior to that, she was my colleague at The Intercept, where she was the politics editor. Briahna Joy Gray. Briahna, thank you so much for taking the time to talk to me.
It's my pleasure, Glenn, always.
Yeah, it's good to see you. So, obviously, this is a big adjustment for you and everybody else who worked on the Sanders campaign, given that the campaign not only just came to an end, but also Senator Sanders announced on a live stream yesterday with Joe Biden that he was throwing his unvarnished and full support behind the Biden campaign and made an argument about why he thinks his supporters ought to do that. And yet very quickly you announced in your individual capacity that you don't intend to endorse, in your words, Joe Biden. There's a campaign underway to kind of coerce or bully or cajole, or I guess in some cases, I haven't seen it yet, persuade Sanders supporters to follow in Senator Sanders' footsteps and get behind Joe Biden. But at least as of now, you say that you're not going to. What is the rationale for your decision, at least as of now, not to support the Biden candidacy?
Well, first I want to say, as I did in my tweet, that I just have the utmost respect for Bernie Sanders and the decision that he made. We play very different roles. He is a sitting senator. He has different political commitments and rationale that I'm not privy to in their entirety. And, I'm only here. As you know, it was a difficult decision for me to leave The Intercept, which was an amazing job and an amazing experience. And the only reason I left was because of how committed I was to the policy platform that Bernie Sanders was running on. And I felt as though if he called on me, if the campaign wanted me to participate, this meant enough. It was such a unique and historic opportunity that it was worth leaving a job that I really loved to do. And that commitment, my commitment to those underlying policies, hasn't changed now that Bernie Sanders isn't in the race. And so while I respect his decision, my hope is that if Joe Biden is in fact going to be the nominee, that he makes significantly more significant concessions than he has done so far. And I think that although a lot of times Bernie Sanders supporters were caricatured as somehow members of a cult who would, do whatever he said, the reality is that by far, I think, compared to other candidates, Bernie Sanders supporters were committed to the policies first. And until Joe Biden makes a much more fulsome effort to hear, not just hear and listen and kind of like the bromides that get thrown out, but to commit to pursuing and fighting for some of the progressive agenda that made Bernie Sanders so popular and which majorities of Americans support, that he's going to have a lot of trouble getting a substantial number of the Bernie camp on board.
It is an irony, right, that for so long we heard Democrats and their media allies claiming that the Sanders campaign was more akin to a cult of personality. And yet, just as was true in 2016, Bernie Sanders is going to have a lot more difficulty corralling his supporters behind Joe Biden than the Democratic establishment had in getting everybody to snap into line behind Biden once he became the anointed candidate. They had no trouble at all. They were quite obedient, quite responsive to the dictates, whereas, as you say, the Sanders campaign is going to have a lot more difficulty ordering its supporters around because Bernie Sanders supporters are devoted not to the candidate or to the person, but to the cause. But let me ask you that about the cause, because the argument that, to the extent that there's a non-bullying or non-bad faith argument being constructed on behalf of the Biden candidacy, and as I said, it's hard to find, but you can find it if you search hard enough. The argument goes something like this, as you know, and I'm interested in your response to it. To the extent that you care about things like Medicare for all, which means expanding health coverage for people or raising the minimum wage or defending policies that will benefit the working class or eliminate income inequality, Joe Biden certainly isn't your dream candidate. He doesn't agree with your positions, such as Medicare for all, but he's going to get more medical coverage and access to people than Donald Trump will. So he's incrementally better. And therefore, it's really either a matter of ideological purity or privilege to say, I don't care about these incremental benefits and the extent to which they're going to help the lives of marginalized people until the candidate comes along who gives me everything I want and agrees with me on everything. I'm not willing to support them, even if it means risking a second term for Donald Trump. What is your response to that argument?
first and foremost, we are still in the context of a primary. And we're in the context of a primary where a lot is still quite uncertain. We have recent allegations that have been levied against Joe Biden. We have hints from on high that there might be efforts to try to have other people run on the Democratic ticket, people who have purportedly performed well with their coronavirus response. We have questions about who's going to be chosen as a vice president. So this is a time where we should be actually pushing Joe Biden to be a better candidate and to be the more electable candidate than he will be if he continues to run on the platform that he has right now. And so the effort to push Biden to the left should be perceived not as an effort by people who don't care if Trump is in office. It's an effort to say, we see his vulnerabilities, and now is the time for him to act to improve upon him. And that is something that wasn't understood, I think, in 2016, that the critiques of Hillary Clinton, if they had been dealt with honestly in the primary and actually addressed instead of dismissed as somehow irrelevant, pretending that they don't exist in the primary doesn't mean that they won't manifest in a general election where you have people on the right and the far right who are a lot less charitable and aren't interested in having a conversation about rehabilitating people's records. They just want to destroy you. And to the point about privilege, as you well know, Bernie Sanders supporters were the most working class supporters in the race. They were the most diverse constituency in the race, and they were the most female constituency in the race. More African Americans gave to the Bernie Sanders campaign than any other campaign. And the same is true for all other metrics. Bernie Sanders did better with Latino voters than anyone else in the race and consistently polled second best with African American voters throughout the race. So what you're really seeing is people who don't have privilege, who don't have the ability to sit on their laurels and say a return to the status quo is enough, who can't just say, who won't just throw their hat in with a candidate that says nothing will fundamentally change when things were so fundamentally wrong before Trump was elected.
So let me ask you about one of the parts of your answer that you just expressed, which was the idea that there are serious flaws with Joe Biden politically and substantively, that the Republicans, the right, the far right, the Trump campaign are going to very aggressively exploit, that were treated, as you described it, more generously by Democrats generally and the Sanders campaign particularly. It's really a difficult thing to ask people to engage in self-reflection. The Hillary 2016 campaign hasn't done it 4 years later to date. They've blamed everybody else from Russia and WikiLeaks to Jim Comey and the New York Times and have not engaged in self-reflection. It's really probably unfair to ask somebody who's devoted their heart and soul to a candidacy for the last year to do it essentially a week after the campaign ended. But I do wonder whether you agree with the critiques voiced by a lot of prominent and very dedicated Sanders supporters that the Sanders campaign owed it to their followers, to their supporters, to their donors, and to Democrats in the country generally to have been more willing to highlight the flaws of Joe Biden as a candidate and as a politician, not necessarily even to increase their chances of winning, but to make sure that he was really vetted before he became the nominee rather than after. Is that a valid critique of your campaign?
It's a really difficult question, and as you pointed out, one that a lot of people in the campaign wrestled with. It's hard in part because we all know that because of the relationship between Senator Sanders and the media, that relationship being that the media, the mainstream media anyway, doesn't always treat him fairly, is that if he were to raise a number of issues, that they would be framed as Bernie Sanders does a dirty trick as opposed to addressing the substance of the issue. So, for example, I remember there was a moment in the campaign where Bernie Sanders was the first campaign to unionize, and Elizabeth Warren's campaign subsequently did it as well. And our campaign, of course, there were a lot of negative stories about us unionizing, et cetera, et cetera. Later down the line, I noticed that Elizabeth Warren's campaign, although it had gotten a lot of positive press, rightly so, for unionizing, hadn't actually had a CBA, a collective bargaining agreement, something like over 100 days after it had initially expressed intent to unionize. And so I tweeted, this is an interesting story. Like, I DM'd some folks, nobody picked it up. And then I tweeted out loud, it's interesting that under Bernie Sanders' labor plan, Elizabeth's campaign would be a couple of days out from having to undergo mandatory arbitration because they have taken so long to actually get a CBA going. What's going on there? And instead of actually reporting on the story of what was going on with their unionization efforts, the story was that about my tweet with absolutely no substance of the underlying issue. And then, of course, a couple of days later, they had a CBA. So, that's a relatively minor issue. What happens then if Bernie Sanders says, look, I don't know, and nobody knows except for Tara Reid and and Joe Biden, rather, what happened in 1993 in a hallway on Congress. But Joe Biden benefits as a candidate if he is able to address and resolve those claims prior to entering the general election. Because we all know the argument Donald Trump is rapier, Donald Trump is more egregious in his behavior, doesn't fly. Because we all sat through 2016, and we all know that although Hillary Clinton did nothing wrong personally, has no history at all of sexual misconduct, and has a clean slate on that measure, when Donald Trump's personal failings and his sexual misconduct came to the foreground, what did he do? He, instead of being contrite, at the next debate had a list of Bill Clinton accusers sitting on the front row. So he's not going to play fair. These issues aren't going to go away, and them not being raised by the left is not preserving their candidate. It's just making sure that he's not battle tested when the real fight comes down the line.
So let me ask you about these concessions that you are saying you hope to see from the Biden campaign, either to make him more electable or to just make him better politically. It's very easy, I found, to put pretty language into a party platform and to make a lot of high-minded promises. It's something that I learned not just rationally, which I always knew, but viscerally when I fell for Barack Obama in 2007 on the issues that I was most focused on, which were civil liberties and were reversing the war and terror abuses, only to find that in the first year he very aggressively continued most of those abuses and intensified and exacerbated many of them as well. And learned the lesson that just, campaigns will say anything to win. As he said about Hillary Clinton in 2008, he said Hillary Clinton will say anything to win and then change nothing. Are there, Joe Biden is somebody who's been in public life since he's 29 when he was elected to the Senate. So it's 50 years as a senator and a vice president. He has a record as the architect of the prison state, defending credit card companies against bankrupt consumers, being a corporatist, being a militarist, one of the key players in the Senate for getting the authorization to pass the Iraq War, the whole record. Are there really things that he could do between now and November that could make you change your view of who he is and what kind of president he will be?
I think it's difficult because you're right. You're identifying that there are two prongs to what Joe Biden has to deal with if he wants to earn the trust and support of the left. And one is that he has to not just commit to various policies, he has to provide some assurance that he's actually going to follow through when he's in office, which is difficult given, as you pointed out, that he has a record that is opposite in many ways of everything that he's purporting to run on now. And I think something that would help people to trust his commitments would be a selection of a VP that also espouses those beliefs and other staffing choices that would reflect a genuine commitment to a left policy platform. I also think that there are certain kinds of commitments that if you make them out loud, it's more difficult to walk back just because they are so popular and there's so much of a focus on them. So I do think if Joe Biden is going to say, as he did in the live stream yesterday, that healthcare is a human right, that it's incumbent on the left, all of the left, progressives, including Elizabeth Warren supporters, to say, okay, that's not a slogan. Healthcare is a human right isn't just a slogan you can throw out to say that you have crunchy granola feelings about people not dying in the street. In fact, Donald Trump was the one who ran in 2016 saying people shouldn't die in the street. What you have to do is commit specifically to a policy that treats healthcare as though it's a human right and guarantees that everyone can get treatment for all diseases, not just coronavirus, all diseases, because you shouldn't die because you're simply poor and can't afford treatment. And that policy, as we all know, is Medicare for all. It's popular. It's supported by a majority of Americans, not just a majority of Democrats. There is no political reason not to run on Medicare for all, especially when you have these really convoluted debates happening right now over who did what in coronavirus relief, who, shut down flights from China at the right time, and this back and forth, that is, to the average voter, is going to seem very messy, unclear, and for a lot of people who are favorable to Trump, it's going to seem like Democrats not giving him credit where they think credit is due. I think if you want to draw a bright line about who can take care of people the most with coronavirus relief, it's going to be about trying to guarantee people large dollar sums in cash relief, $2,000 a month at minimum, and backing policies like Medicare for All, which guarantee that everyone in the middle of a global pandemic can actually get treatment for healthcare, not just paying for coronavirus treatment, but for also the people who think they might have coronavirus symptoms, go to the hospital, find out that they have the flu, and are now stuck with the high cost of their treatment.
So as my last question, Briahna, let me ask you the following question about the movement that arose around the Sanders campaign and that ultimately supported it. A lot of people felt, and I think I was one of them, that everything was lined up for the best possible chance, certainly in the last couple of decades, probably in our lifetime, for an insurgent, kind of left-wing populist candidate to become the nominee of the Democratic Party, because Bernie had run in 2016, had won 43 states, had virtually universal name recognition, had demonstrated this model of funding to sustain a very well-funded campaign, had earned a lot of goodwill among the Democratic electorate, independents, kind of soft partisans, that everything was just very lined up. Aside from the fact that the front runner all along, Joe Biden, was obviously weak and vulnerable in a lot of ways, and yet, as it turned out, the establishment, being the establishment, did what it should be expected to do, which is consolidate. There's an article in the New York Times this morning about the role President Obama played in consolidating the entire party behind one alternative instead of letting it be fractured the way the Republicans were against Trump in 2016. Does that lead you to start wondering whether the Democratic Party can ever be a real vessel for empowering this movement, and whether instead this movement ought to look elsewhere? Or do you continue to be optimistic about the strategy of having a left-wing populist insurgent movement try and infiltrate and attach itself to the Democratic Party?
And that's a really difficult question. And I think that you're right that a lot of us are doing that sort of soul searching right now, especially given that Bernie Sanders, as much as the campaign framed itself as revolutionary in some respects, was hardly a radical candidate. He ran on policies that in any other similarly situated affluent country like ours are considered very moderate, run-of-the-mill. He's a FDR Democrat, right?
Yeah, I think like German politicians said here in Germany he would be like in the center. And if you look, for example, and compare Bernie Sanders to Corbyn makes Bernie Sanders look like Jeb Bush. Maybe that's a little bit of an overstatement, but not much. So you're right. He was far from a radical candidate.
Right. But the reality is, if in the face of Bernie Sanders, the corporate wing of the Democratic Party, or the corporate Democratic Party, exerts the kind of influence that it did in orchestrating the mass dropout before Super Tuesday, which ensured Bernie's defeat, well, it's a legitimate question. What will they let through the gate, if not Bernie? I don't know that we are entirely there yet. I think it will be interesting to see what kind of pressures and concessions we can extract from Joe Biden as a candidate during this primary process. And it'll be interesting to see what might happen if, in fact, the Democratic Party loses again in the fall. Will they be confronted with the reality that their kind of third wave triangulation doesn't work anymore, to the extent that it ever did? Will they be forced to make a real choice between letting go of some of their pro-capital policies and relationships with corporate America in order to win electorally, or are their interests sufficiently aligned with the right wing of this country in terms of their economic interests that they're actually comfortable losing again and again, as long as it is the case that their other interests are met? And I think that framing it that way and having our movement continue to make clear what the but systems of power operating in this context is going to be really important. That was Bernie Sanders' ultimate strength, and what I really looked forward to seeing in a general election where you could see him challenge Donald Trump for betraying his promise to working class Americans, to reveal his populism as faux populism. And what I really, really don't want to happen is for the right to completely own this populist aesthetic, retreat and for the Democratic Party to retreat into a Bloomberg style superficial liberalism that holds up minority groups in a kind of tokenistic way while pursuing right-wing economic policies, and then have working class people in a position where they have to choose between Trump's faux populism, which at least gives lip service to working class people, and a kind of Bloombergian liberalism, which they feel very alienated from. And that could result in some pretty draconian, fascistic outcomes for our country. So I hope people really are clear-minded about what the options are going forward.
Yeah, absolutely. So as a reminder to our viewers, immediately following this episode, which will be in just a couple minutes, I will be doing a live chat with our viewers. You just need to enter this separate part of the Intercept's YouTube channel. We'll post the link on Twitter and Facebook from both my account and the Intercept's. Briahna, I know that it's been a really gratifying campaign for you on the one hand, and on the other, you probably were the target of more bile and toxicity in terms of attacks than anybody in the Bernie Sanders campaign, with the exception possibly of the candidate, which is its own show exploring and trying to understand why that is. But I know for a lot of Sanders supporters, you were one of the real bright spots of the Sanders campaign, and I really appreciate the work you've done over the last year, particularly given everything you've had to endure. And I appreciate your taking the time to talk to me as well.
Thank you, Glenn. It's always a pleasure. And thank you for all of the work and advocacy you and the Intercept have been doing.
All right, Briahna, thanks so much.